World Speech Day. My name is Simon Gibson. I'm the founder of World Speech Day, and the purpose of the day, the purpose of World Speech Day, is to celebrate speeches and speech making through live public events around the world. Typically, we have events in around 100, 110 countries. This year, for self-evident reasons, it's less so, it's curtailed, but it has allowed us to explore other ways to use public speaking and speech to reach out, like this live stream. And this next session on live stream is dedicated to rhetoric and the art of public speaking. We've got some terrific contributors from around the world talking about different aspects of rhetoric. I've called it Rhetoric Remix because I'm hoping they'll touch on the kind of the ancient art of rhetoric as we've understood it in the Western tradition, but also talking about that in a very 21st century prism, so that we'll get a sense of the arc of rhetoric from tradition to now. The first contributor is Steve Liano from New York City. I'm going to introduce Steve in a mo and put him on the main screen. Steve is there now, I think.
Yep, I'm here.
It's a little wobbly, the screen, but anyway, that's great. And I'm thrilled you can contribute, Steve. Excited to hear your ideas, and please just do a brief introduction, and then we'll catch up on the speech.
Okay, sounds good. So I should just go ahead.
Are you there, Steve?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, good. I guess I'll just go ahead and get started then. It's good to see everybody. Thank you, Simon. Thanks to everybody joining us for World Speech Day. It's quite an honor to be here. And I am a professor of rhetoric at St. John's University here in New York City and Queens. And I teach public speaking, and I teach communication. I teach all kinds of courses related to rhetoric. I teach argumentation. I teach debate and things like that. And what I want to speak about today is precisely the thing that we see happening all over the world. And in our current situation with the coronavirus epidemic, when things get very serious, people turn to speech. All of us are glued to our televisions and radios waiting for another broadcast, another update from the government or from the Disease Control Center. And it's speech that we rely on, public address, traditional public address, as we always have. The technology has changed a little bit, but we're always relying on people saying to us, giving us information, and speaking to us in a way that we can understand and that motivates us. So I wanted to share some principles of rhetoric that are ancient and modern under this idea that we're all looking for information, and most of the information that we're getting is through public address, which is very surprising in a day and age of all this technology, is how incredibly important speech is when things become quite serious. So the first principle I'll share with you in thinking about old rhetoric and new is that rhetoric has always been and will always be about people. A lot of people talk about rhetoric. They say it's about word choice. It's about semantics. It's about style. It's about the quality of argument, logic, reason, things like that. But rhetoric at its fundamental heart is about people and relationships between people. It's about using your voice and approaching a group of people and saying, I think you might have this wrong, or I have a better idea, or what is it that you think we should, what's the biggest problem that faces us? What is it that you think we should do? Rhetoric is always about people, and it's people-centric. So a lot of times in our politics today, people say, well, what we need is more facts. We need better information, more facts, and we need people to understand what the facts and the experts are. But this approach has been failing us precisely because we've forgotten that the purpose of rhetoric, the point of rhetoric, is to promote interaction between people and for people to identify with each other and commune with each other. In fact, the word communication has the word commune in it as a Latin root. So that's the first principle. It's about people primarily and about human beings primarily interacting. So secondly then, the second principle that I derive from this is that rhetoric requires that you have a understanding of who it is that you're talking to. So a lot of people will teach this, or a lot of the assumptions about public speaking is you have to have the good information first, superior information first, great research first. But I would say at least as important as that is you have to have an understanding of your audience and who it is that you're speaking to. Who's the audience? What are they about? But it goes a bit deeper than that. We can look to the world of algorithms and tracking on the internet and these controversial things about data points and how much am I giving away about my habits to major corporations and to information services who advertise to me through shopping and this and that. And that's one way of understanding the audience. But the more classical way of understanding the audience, the way the ancient Greeks or the Romans and the Western rhetorical tradition would have thought about it, is who does my audience imagine themselves to be? Who does my audience see themselves as? What is it that they think that they are all about? And that's the much, 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 much more important thing than the way our audience actually functions. Because even all that data about shopping or clicking on websites and stuff, people are looking at themselves as they imagine themselves to be. We all have a story that we tell ourselves about who we are and what kind of society we live in and what part of society we're a part of and that we experience and participate in. We all tell a story to ourselves. So this is incredibly important for the rhetorician if you want to motivate people to change their ways or to do something different that they've never thought about before. This is an incredibly important thing to research, is not only who my audience actually is, but who do they imagine themselves to be. And that requires the study of traditions, culture, language, food, music. The rhetorician has to know a lot of different things to be successful. They have to be familiar with both anthropology and also science and also medicine and how people receive medicine and how people receive science in different cultures in different parts of the world, depending on who your audience is. We normally focus on a speech topic and we say, if I get my topic good and I have good research, I'm good to go, and they'll get it. But if I present it in a way that they're not accustomed to, it might be unintelligible to them. A really important part of rhetoric is making your speech intelligible. That is, not just being able to be comfortably heard or loud enough, but to speak in a way that they recognize as important and valuable with your cultural and emotional and traditional sensibilities. You can't really look those up mathematically and determine what it means to be valuable. Every culture and every group, every subculture, every group of people in a country have a different understanding of value. And it's connected to who they imagine they are and what story they're telling about themselves to themselves and to each other. So the final assumption, before I get into a handy tip here in the bottom of my remarks here, is that the audience is the proper subject of rhetoric, nothing else. And the reason I say that, and the reason that might be kind of shocking to people, is I think we operate under the idea that good information is going to save us, and that facts are going to save us, and that reason and logic are going to save us. But all of these things are not working the way we imagine that they should. In fact, we could say that these are the narratives that we tell ourselves about what we prefer. So to bring up a funny kind of example about this, with the coronavirus scare here in the United States, it's impossible to buy toilet rolls, or toilet paper as we call it. You can't find them anywhere. Everyone's sold out. And on the internet, on social media, people are making fun of this endlessly. But people are contradictory beings. Human beings are very contradictory. The same people making fun of the ridiculousness of this are also the same people who are hoarding toilet rolls. And they see no contradiction in this, because what other people should do is appropriate for them, but I'm the exception. Maybe this is a very particularly American thing, I don't know, but I feel like there's some global crossover of this. It's like, it's okay for me to do it, but everyone else should do it. For example, the governor of New York just announced about 15 minutes ago that all bars, movie theaters, gyms, and restaurants will close at 8 p.m. tonight because people believe that there should be a quarantine for the virus, but it doesn't apply to them. I'm healthy. I'm not going to get sick. It's fine for me to go out and have a drink with my friends, but everyone else should stay inside. So this is a fundamental understanding. People are inconsistent. Let's look to a more scientific sensibility for this instead of maybe that anecdotal one isn't good enough for you. Let's look to evolutionary psychology and cognitive psychology and what's coming out of the research in these fields about how people think and behave. Well, people are very, very, very bad at reasoning. People are very, very bad at logic. Any psychological experiment can tell you that. Any psychological study can tell you that. But what's really interesting about it is how most people believe that reason and logic are evolutionary traits, or there's something natural about those in human beings. Evolutionary and cognitive psychologists are telling us that these are useful concepts from an evolutionary or developmental standpoint, but they are highly unlikely. And the reason why is because people differ so much by accidental characteristics in how well they can reason and how well they can use logic, that it actually makes more scientific sense to place reason and logic in the realm of communication. That is, we developed reason and logic because we like to persuade each other, not because they're persuasive on their own. We developed them as ways of speaking that allow us different flavors of enjoying one of our favorite treats, talking to one another and trying to get people to see the world our way. This is really insightful stuff. If you want more on that, you can read the work of Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier, who put out an amazing book about 2 or 3 years ago called The Enigma of Reason. And this is an incredibly fascinating tale of how we got to where we were and believing that reason and logic are going to save us. So if that's not going to do it, if I present excellent facts, my audience can say, oh, yeah, okay, that's good, but doesn't apply to me. How do we get around this? Well, it turns out there's actually quite a useful theory for all the rhetoricians out there who want to practice persuading one another and speaking to one another and trying to get people to get ideas across. And I have my ancient copy of it here. It's Chaim Perlman and Lucy Albrecht-Titica's book, The New Rhetoric. If you read French, I highly recommend it in French, but I do not read French. As a poorly educated American, I speak English okay, and I speak American fairly well. But mostly I'm learning the new language of my students, which is memes, which is a whole rhetorical speech all on its own. But in The New Rhetoric, Perlman and Albrecht-Titica are trying to solve a huge problem, which is how do we get good ideas across to people when they don't accept good ideas unless they are rooted in sort of terms of emotion and personal evaluation and narrative. It's very messy. But one of the things they noticed when they're thinking about audience is that if you're writing a paper, an essay, a blog post, or book, you already are addressing an audience. What are the implicit ways you're addressing that audience? Well, they're actually quite nice. You address the audience as very calm, reasonable people who can step outside of their own views for a few minutes to entertain a new idea. And they call this model the universal audience. Not because everyone is like this, but because when we sit down to write, we often write to an audience that has incredibly good characteristics of thought, critical thinking, and things like that. And that's very telling. When you see that as a universal thing across different languages, different kinds of writing, whether it's philosophical or whether it's political, the examples they give are pretty good. But you're always writing as if someone encountered it, they would be able to suspend their own belief and engage it. And I think this is very optimistic. I think what it shows us is as rhetors, we have choices. We have the choice to stoop to the lowest common denominator of our audience and use what would work. We would call that pandering. And this is something that universally throughout rhetoric and through philosophy has been decried. In fact, this is the critique that Aristotle makes of the sophists of ancient Athens. And of course, Plato has nothing good to say about the sophists. But the sophists, in terms of pandering, there's another way to look at them in terms of universal audience, which is they are speaking in a way that they think works for people. They are speaking in a way that they think their audience will rise to the occasion of being the kind of thinker they imagine them to be. So we don't want to pander, but we do want to account for our audience and how they imagine themselves to be. So what can we do? Well, we can speak in the way to raise the audience to the level of thinking and reasoning that we feel is good. We can encourage our audience to be critical thinkers by speaking to them as if they already were and making our speech attractive in that way and speaking to their desires as if they already know and they are already quite sharp. And if you take this into account, this universal audience theory and this idea of raising the bar a bit in the way you speak and not trying to pander or lower or dumb down your speech, you can see varying ways of doing this through the national addresses of our governments across the world in terms of the coronavirus epidemic. There are many health officers in the United States who are speaking in this kind of universal audience way of that we all sort of understand the need to be healthy. We all understand the risks of health and things like that. And they're not dumbing it down at all. But at the same time, just telling people that they need to stay home because it's the right thing to do is not going to be persuasive enough. We need to speak in a way that takes into account their narrative, their beliefs, and things like that. So the final thought is, most of the time when we're going to speak and we're going to address people and we're going to try to be persuasive, we think we're asking them to make a 180. Our assumption of the audience is, oh, they're not going to want to do this. They're going to be against it. But if we think in terms of universal audience, that is, I'm going to address them as reasonable people where we have lots of shared value, lots of shared cultural ideals. Aristotle called this the epideictic mode of speaking, the speech about values. So like on your country's national Independence Day, there are all kinds of epideictic speeches that the government will give. And on different kinds of days, like Armistice Day, for example, leaders of the government will give very somber speeches about what we value and who we are as a people and how we'll never forget this and all these kind of things. The Epidictic is a very powerful resource for persuasive argument because it constitutes us as being on the same page. So I could walk into a persuasive situation and think, oh my gosh, I have to turn them 180 degrees around. Well, this is a failing way to approach it. Think in terms of universal audience. What are the principles and values that you're already on board with? Chances are, most persuasive acts are maybe a 30 degree pivot, not a 180, maybe a 20 to 30 degree pivot. And the more you have in common with that audience when you speak, the better off they'll be to make the kind of decision you want if you constitute them as thinking and caring people who share a set of values and a set of perspectives on the world that matters and that's important. Then your persuasive task will be much limited. And you'll also be doing a huge service to that audience by constituting them as thinking and feeling people. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share today. I will leave you with one final thought. Ralph Ellison, the famous American author of Invisible Man, wrote an essay in the early 1970s called The Man Behind the Stove at Chehaw Station, where he discussed audience. And he had something I thought was very powerful to say, is that most people approach an audience thinking that they know that they're going to get. It's a mechanical operation. They approach the audience like a jukebox or like a vending machine. Oh, there's the chocolate bar I want. I'll invest, I'll push the right buttons, and I'll get what I want. And this vending machine approach is incredibly detrimental. You can't think of your audience as a mechanical operation. You have to think of them as also sort of fellow rhetors, and instead of a mechanical relationship, you can think of one that's maybe more like a co-conspirator, is what I always say. We're in this together. We're in this persuasive moment together. So that's what I wanted to share. I think audience is the subject of rhetoric, and I'll be happy to take any questions people might have or any discussion that might come from those remarks. Thank you very much, Simon.
Well, wonderful. That's just a tour de force, Steve. No less than be expected, but it's always nice to be proved right. So I'm thrilled that you've been able to come on board. But quite a lot of the discussion actually today has been about audience. We had Mette Sergesen from Denmark this morning talking about creating an audience, and her observation that the Prime Minister of Denmark in recent times has talked about the need for good citizenship. Mm-hmm. And that the way she has positioned the whole coronavirus thing is that it's an act of good citizenship to isolate, in the sense that who doesn't want to be a good citizen?
Right. That's right.
If you're trying to appeal to belief and the belief of an audience, then positioning it as good citizenship is quite a neat way to try and tap into that sense of identity. So a lot of what she said timed and was, interestingly coincidental with yours. I'm also fascinated about the notion of how you create an audience.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to stand in front of 200 people and think that those 200 people are an audience. Right. But they're not. They are 200 people.
Right.
How do you go about creating an audience that thinks, responds, has this magic, a communication almost between itself? We see that in the great rallies where you can sense something different is taking place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's not about speech, it's about the audience. How do we create audiences?
Boy, that's such a rich question. I'll say a couple of things. First of all, the American rhetorician Kenneth Burke had huge trouble with this in the 1950s. He was a very, very avowed communist, and he went to the American Communist Party meetings in the middle of McCarthy and said, look, we can't be calling Americans workers. No one wants to be a worker. We have to think of another word for this. And they said, well, you're a heathen. You're not a Leninist. You're kicked out of this. So in his efforts of trying to create a better audience got him blacklisted from both the Communist Party and the McCarthy hearings at the same time. So that's a neat trick. Only a rhetorician could perform such a great magic trick. I would say, how do you create an audience? James Crosswhite from the University of Oregon wrote a fantastic book several years ago called The Realm of Reason. And in this book, he challenges this notion of audience as a temporary state. He says, most of the time we are audienced. It's a verb. It's happening to us. As we walk around in our lives, we're hearing snippets of conversation. We're seeing billboards and advertisements. We're catching radio broadcasts out of open windowed bars and things like this. So we're being audienced all the time. So the question is, how does one access the different pulls on attention that people are facing. A lot of times when we have a formal event, like a formal speech, and people are coming because they're interested in the topic that you're supposed to be speaking about, they're coming in, but they're atomized. They're bouncing everywhere. We can look to David Bohm, the famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist. Later in his career, he took up an interest in communication. He wrote several books on dialogue after he had stopped working on lasers, which he won the Nobel Prize for. And he said, when people get together, they're like photons. They bounce around everywhere, and they might even be in two places at the same time. They're very random. But if you can focus them as a laser, you can cut through any material if you focus them the right way. The question is, how do we do that? And he thought dialogue was the way of doing that, getting people to share their ideas and feelings and hopes and their perspective might have people finding common ground with one another better. My advice is when people come in and they want to hear the topic, you have no idea why they want to hear it. Our assumption is, oh, they're opposed to me. But this is the most thin conception you could have. They might also be coming because someone they're interested in romantically is coming and they want to spend some time with them and show them, hey, I like this too. That's on the extreme edges. So one of the things to do, very first thing to do, is to constitute them as the audience you would like them to be. Why are we here? What brings us together tonight? And it's shared values, like citizenship. I think that's a great term. It can mean a lot of different things, but for people interested in the rhetoric of citizenship, I highly recommend Plato's dialogue, Protagoras, because Protagoras is having a debate with Socrates about this very word and the rhetorical understanding of it versus the philosophical or Socratic understanding of it. Quite a bit different. What is citizenship? An ability to adapt, an ability to come together in times of crisis, an ability to find and change new values and new practices. That's Protagoras' sense. But for Socrates, it's something much deeper and more permanent. And I think that this more fungible one is the one that we need in times of great global emergency. And so it's a great term to be exploring at this time.
Yeah, well, I'll just have one final little thing, which is on that notion of citizenship. I increasingly get the feeling that public speaking is part of citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
That it isn't a right, but that it's a driver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I don't mean to cut you off there if you had more to say.
No, I
okay.
do.
Yeah, I mean, we can look to I think the if you're interested in that, public speaking as a way of embodying citizenship. So there are theories of rhetoric that we become ourselves when we're speaking. We become who we are through speech. We express ourselves, and oftentimes you can experience this when you're talking to someone or you're giving a talk and you're like, wow, that was pretty good. Who said that? And you realize you're sort of watching yourself speaking. Athletes call this being in the zone. This idea that we're not really who we are unless we're articulating. We're articulating beings and articulated beings is a very powerful notion. And in fact, you look to the educational systems of ancient Rome, and that's all they taught. For the wealthy Romans, the Romans of a certain class, all they're teaching them is how to speak to one another about incredibly important and uncertain legal and political issues. And that's what education is can you access the various values and things to constitute yourself as a Roman figure of authority. Quintilian famously says, always speak in front of a crowd so that they imagine a Roman legion is going to march up behind you at the end of every point. So this kind of authoritative, connected, emotional kind of speech that's connected to one's culture and one's citizenry is incredibly important. I think we can just look to, all eyes who are interested in this should look to the UK, because I think the UK are leaders on this with the increasing demand for oralcy as a competency in public schooling. And I think that's so exciting to me. Here in the United States, we've thrown public money since the 19th century after speech and debate programs as kind of an extracurricular thing, but it's still not a core competency in public education in most states in the United States to show an oral component. But in higher ed, oral exams are coming back, and I think the UK has many organizations, from the English Speaking Union to other private organizations, working on oralcy and trying to get that into all the schools as a core educational component. And I think that's the place where the best innovation on that question is happening in the world right now.
Well, thanks, Steve. One of the contributors earlier was Dr. Tom Wright, who heads up Speaking Citizens and the Oracy Project in the UK. Mm-hmm. So I'd probably be fascinated to learn. Thank you very much, Steve. I'm going to move on to Dr. Alam now. I'm so thrilled to have had you as a contributor, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I might hang out for a minute if that's okay. I don't know if I need to leave immediately.
I'm just going to switch